In the streets of ancient Catania, a young noblewoman defied the greatest power of her time. Her name was Agatha, and her story would forever transform the meaning of bravery. While the Roman Empire deployed all its might against the Christians, she dared to say no to the wrong man, unleashing a storm that would lead her to become one of the most venerated saints in history. This is the story of a woman who preferred martyrdom to renouncing her convictions, and whose legacy, 2,000 years later, continues to inspire millions. Chapter 1. The Noble Origins. In the fertile lands of Sicily, where the Mediterranean caresses the shores of Catania with its crystal-clear waters, and under the imposing gaze of Mount Etna, the year 231 AD marked the birth of a child destined to change history. The Roman Empire was at its peak, and with it, the persecution of Christ's followers on the island had reached unprecedented levels. In a majestic villa overlooking the sea, surrounded by gardens perfumed with Sicilian flowers, Agatha was born, daughter of one of the most noble and respected families in Catania. Her parents, secret Christians in a time of persecution, received this child as a gift from heaven, never imagining that their little girl was destined to become one of the most venerated martyrs of the Catholic Church. On the day of her birth, according to ancient chronicles, a gentle light illuminated the room where her mother gave birth, and a sweet aroma of roses filled the air, a first sign of the holiness that would mark her life. Agatha's early years passed in a privileged environment where education and culture intermingled with the Christian faith, taught in secret by her parents and discreet tutors who visited the family villa. Not only did she stand out for her extraordinary physical beauty, which only grew with each passing year, but also for her sharp intelligence and special sensitivity to the teachings of Christ. While other girls her age entertained themselves with games and diversions typical of their social class, Agatha showed a natural inclination toward prayer and contemplation, spending long hours in the family garden where she had created a small refuge for her moments of communion with God. Her education was exceptional for a young woman of her time. Her parents, aware of the importance of learning, ensured that she received instruction in the liberal arts, literature, and philosophy. However, it was in the Christian teachings that she found her true passion. In secret, away from the pagan society, she learned the sacred scriptures, memorized the Psalms, and absorbed the stories of the first martyrs, never suspecting that she herself would join that glorious catalogue of faith's witnesses. Her mother, in particular, took care to pass on not only the knowledge of the faith, but also the art of discretion, so necessary in those times of persecution. The atmosphere of tension and danger surrounding the Christians in 3rd century Sicily did not escape young Agatha's notice. From her window, she occasionally saw funeral processions for those who had been executed for their faith, and she heard the murmurs of servants discussing the latest persecutions in the city. These realities, far from frightening her, forged within her a spirit of extraordinary strength. As she grew in age and grace, so too did her conviction that her life was destined for something greater than the privileges of her noble birth. Deep in her heart, the seed of martyrdom was beginning to sprout, though she could not yet imagine in what specific way she would be called to bear witness to her faith. Chapter 2. The Call to Holiness. When Agatha reached the age of 15, the age at which young noblewomen began to be presented in society, she experienced a profound spiritual transformation that would decisively alter the course of her life. One spring morning, while praying in the small secret chapel that her family kept hidden in the villa's basement, she had a mystical experience that would mark her forever. Ancient chronicles recount that while contemplating an old crucifix brought from Jerusalem, she felt an inner call so powerful that tears spontaneously welled from her eyes. This intimate encounter with the divine awakened in young Agatha an unshakable determination. To the astonishment of her parents, who had already begun receiving marriage proposals from the most distinguished families in Sicily, she declared her decision to dedicate her life entirely to Christ. It was not a passing fancy of adolescence, nor a decision taken lightly. The resoluteness in her eyes revealed the depth of her commitment. At family dinners, she began speaking with wisdom beyond her years, clearly explaining the reasons for her choice and firmly defending her decision to remain a virgin out of love for Christ. News of her decision elicited varied reactions among those closest to her. Her mother, who had nurtured her faith secretly for years, recognized in her daughter's determination the work of divine grace and became her staunchest ally. Her father, though deeply Christian himself, struggled between respecting his daughter's vocation and the concerns of a Roman nobleman who had to maintain appearances in a society hostile to Christianity. The household servants, silent witnesses to the young girl's transformation, began to notice changes in her daily routine. Long hours of prayer, discreet fasts, and an increasing dedication to charitable works carried out with extreme caution. Agatha's life took a radical turn after her decision. Her luxurious dresses were gradually replaced by simpler garments, though still appropriate for her social class, so as not to arouse suspicion. Her jewelry began to disappear, secretly sold to help the persecuted Christians hiding in Catania's catacombs. She established a strict routine that combined her social obligations with long hours of prayer and study of the scriptures. At night, while the rest of the house slept, she retreated to her garden refuge, where she spent hours contemplating the stars and strengthening her relationship with God. Challenges soon arose. Social pressures increased day by day, and rumors about her decision began to circulate in the aristocratic circles of Catania. Some noble families, especially those who had hoped to forge ties with Agatha's family, started asking awkward questions. The young woman faced each new challenge with a mix of diplomacy and firmness, responding to insinuations with a serene smile that puzzled her interlocutors. Yet no one could have imagined that this decision to dedicate her life to Christ would soon lead her to face trials far harsher than mere society's whispers in Catania. Chapter 3. The Rejected Suitor. Agatha's destiny changed drastically with the arrival of the new Roman consul in Catania. Quintiano, an ambitious and cruel man, had been appointed governor of the Sicilian province by Emperor Decius. His arrival in the city caused a great stir, not only because of his political power, but also due to his well-known hostility toward the Christians. During his first public appearance on the Forum of Catania, his eyes fell upon young Agatha, who was attending the celebrations with her family. The exceptional beauty of the young noble, combined with her dignified bearing and her family's wealth, immediately aroused the consul's greed. It did not take long for him to communicate his intentions to Agatha's family. His emissaries, laden with sumptuous gifts and promises of political power, arrived at the villa with a marriage proposal. Agatha's response was immediate and resolute. Her heart already belonged to Christ, and no man, however powerful, could change her decision. This refusal, expressed with a mix of courtesy and unwavering determination, provoked the anger of Quintiano, who was not accustomed to having his desires thwarted. The rejection became a personal affront to the consul, whose wounded pride began to hatch a revenge that would blend his resentment with the official persecution of the Christians. The threats soon followed. First, they were subtle: insinuations regarding her family's loyalty to the empire, indiscreet questions about their religious practices, and constant surveillance of her movements. Agatha understood that difficult times lay ahead, but far from being intimidated, she intensified her spiritual preparation. She spent more time in prayer, fortifying her spirit for the battle to come. Her parents, aware of the danger looming over the family, tried to persuade her to temporarily leave the city, but she refused, convinced that her testimony was needed precisely in the darkest moments. The situation reached its climax when Quintiano, exercising his authority as the emperor's representative, issued a special decree of persecution against the Christians in Catania. It was the perfect pretext to act against Agatha. One winter night, while the city slept, a detachment of soldiers surrounded the family villa. The moment Agatha had foreseen since her youth had arrived. She was about to begin her true testimony of faith, a trial that would push her to the limits of human endurance and transform her into one of the most luminous examples of fidelity to Christ. Chapter 4. The days in the Lupanar. Quintiano's first strategy to break Agatha's will was to send her to a place that epitomized everything contrary to her vow of purity. The brothel of Aphrodisia, a woman notorious in Catania for her ability to corrupt the virtue of young Christian women. The consul calculated that a month in that environment would be enough to subdue the spirit of the noble maiden. Aphrodisia received precise instructions. She had 30 days to convince Agatha to abandon her faith and accept marriage to Quintiano. To everyone's surprise, the young woman entered that den of perdition with the serenity of one entering a temple, her eyes shining with a determination that baffled her captors. During her confinement, Agatha transformed that place of corruption into a space of silent testimony. Aphrodisia employed all her resources, first with promises of wealth and a life of luxury, then with veiled threats concerning her future and that of her family. She even brought her 9 daughters, renowned for their beauty and persuasive abilities, to try and convince the young woman of the advantages of a life devoted to worldly pleasures. However, to everyone's astonishment, it was Agatha who exerted a transformative influence over them. Her inner peace and the firmness of her convictions began to awaken questions among those women who had never known any other way of life. Weeks passed, and far from weakening, Agatha's faith only grew stronger. She established a routine of prayer that she maintained even under the most adverse circumstances. At night, while the brothel filled with noise and shrill laughter, she transformed her small cell into a sanctuary of peace. The clients who attempted to approach her found themselves inexplicably halted by an invisible force, and soon rumors began circulating about extraordinary phenomena occurring in her presence. Some of the women in the brothel, moved by her example, secretly began to listen to her words about Christ and the dignity of every human being. Finally, Aphrodisia had to appear before Quintiano with a confession that would seal Agatha's fate. It would be easier to soften a rock or turn iron into lead than to turn this young woman away from her Christian faith. My daughters and I have exhausted all our resources over these 30 days, yet she is the one who has transformed us. Her God protects her with a power we cannot overcome. This declaration enraged the consul, who realized that he would need to take more drastic measures to break the will of the one who had become his obsession. The failure of this first attempt to shatter her spirit would mark the beginning of a more violent persecution, where physical torment would replace moral temptation. Chapter 5. The First Martyrdom. The morning of the trial dawned grey over Catania. Quintiano had prepared a public spectacle in the city forum, hoping that public humiliation would break what private corruption had failed to achieve. Agatha was led before the tribunal between 2 guards, her upright figure contrasting with the hostile atmosphere. A silence fell over the crowd as the young woman appeared. Some recognized her as the noble who had secretly aided the needy, while others were simply struck by the serenity radiating from her face. The interrogation began with the formalities of Roman law, but soon turned into a verbal duel in which Agatha's divinely inspired wisdom left the powerful consul without a response. "Why do you reject the honors befitting your noble birth?" roared Quintiano from his tribunal. Agatha's answer rang clearly across the square. True nobility is to be a servant of Christ. Every leading question, every threat, every attempt at intimidation was met by the young woman with a response that combined the firmness of her faith with unyielding dignity. The consul's anger grew with each reply until, finally, losing all control, he ordered the tortures to begin. The executioners advanced with their instruments, yet they found themselves perplexed by the peace emanating from this young woman who seemed to transform the tribunal into a stage for the testimony of faith. What followed was etched in Catania's memory as one of the cruelest yet most inspiring episodes in its history. Quintiano, blinded by rage and humiliation, ordered a torment that would become one of the most recognizable symbols of Agatha's martyrdom. The mutilation of her breasts was intended not only to inflict extreme pain, but also to destroy her femininity and dignity. However, as the executioners carried out their dreadful task, witnesses reported that the saint's face remained serene, her lips moving in constant prayer. Her last words before losing consciousness were, "Cruel tyrant, do you not feel shame torturing in a woman the very breast that once nourished you?" The crowd, which had come expecting to witness the humiliation of a rebel, left that afternoon deeply moved by the testimony of faith they had observed. Agatha was returned to a dark cell, gravely injured, but with her spirit intact. The guards, accustomed to seeing prisoners broken by torture, could not explain the peace that emanated from that cell during the night. What no one knew was that divine intervention was about to manifest in an extraordinary way, and that Agatha's story, far from ending with this first martyrdom, was about to enter its most miraculous chapter. Chapter 6. The Vision of Saint Peter. In the darkness of her cell, Agatha lay on the cold stone floor, her body tormented by the pain of her recent martyrdom. The corridor torches barely illuminated the space with their flickering light, and the silence of the night was broken only by the occasional footsteps of the guards. Despite her suffering, the young martyr kept her lips in constant prayer, alternating between silent supplications and ancient psalms learned in her childhood. It was at that moment of profound darkness that the cell began to fill with a supernatural light, so brilliant that the guards would later swear they saw lightning in a night without a storm. In the midst of that extraordinary light appeared the figure of a venerable old man, whose face radiated a celestial authority that Agatha immediately recognized. It was the Apostle Peter, sent by Christ himself to heal his faithful servant. According to ancient chronicles, the apostle approached the saint with the tenderness of a father and spoke words of comfort that echoed in the cell like a supernatural reverberation. "The Master has sent me, my daughter. He has seen your struggle and heard your prayers." As he spoke, an even more intense light emanated from his hands, and when he touched Agatha's wounds, they began to miraculously heal, not only restoring her flesh, but also renewing her spiritual strength. The effects of this celestial vision went beyond physical healing. Prison witnesses recounted that throughout that night, Agatha's cell remained bathed in an inexplicable radiance, and a sweet aroma, reminiscent of spring flowers, filled the dark prison corridors. The guards, astonished by these events, dared not approach the cell, overwhelmed by a mixture of fear and reverence. Some of them, deeply moved by what they had witnessed that night, began secretly to question their pagan beliefs, initiating a conversion process that would later spread throughout the prison. At dawn, when the jailers entered the cell, expecting to find a weakened, dying prisoner, they were astonished to see Agatha completely healed, her face radiant with an inner light reflecting the supernatural experience of the previous night. The news of this miracle spread quickly through Catania, reaching the ears of Quintiano, who, instead of acknowledging the divine intervention, grew even more furious, interpreting the healing as a challenge to his authority. The consul's response to this miracle would be even more cruel than his previous tortures. But now, Agatha was strengthened both physically and spiritually, ready to face any new trial that lay ahead. Chapter 7. The Second Trial. Agatha's second trial unfolded in an atmosphere charged with tension and anticipation. News of her miraculous healing had spread throughout Catania, drawing a crowd even larger than at her first appearance. Quintiano, humiliated by the failure of his earlier tortures and the rumors of divine intervention, had prepared an even more elaborate judicial spectacle. This time, the tribunal was moved to the city's amphitheater, where the stands were filled not only with Roman citizens, but also with slaves and secret Christians who saw in Agatha a symbol of spiritual resistance. The young woman was brought before the tribunal, and her presence elicited a murmur of astonishment among the crowd. Where they had expected to see a weakened prisoner, they found a radiant woman whose face exuded a supernatural peace. The interrogation began with a new strategy from Quintiano. Instead of the direct threats he had used before, he attempted to adopt a conciliatory tone, offering Agatha one last chance to renounce her faith and accept the privileges that her social position and the consul's protection would grant her. "Consider, noble maiden," he said in a carefully softened voice, "that even the gods have granted you a second chance by preserving your life. Do you not see in this a sign urging you to reconsider your obstinacy?" Agatha's response rang out clear and firm in the amphitheater. "My healing comes from Christ, the only true God, and it is precisely this sign that confirms my faith in him. Your feigned clemency is more insulting than your overt cruelty." These words transformed Quintiano into a figure of terrible fury. The mask of benevolence fell away, revealing a wrath that surpassed even his earlier anger. He ordered that burning coals and shards of broken ceramic be brought forth, declaring that if the fire of passion had not been able to melt his heart, perhaps real fire would subdue his will. The crowd held its breath as the executioners began to scatter the glowing coals and sharp fragments across the ground. "You will walk upon these," decreed Quintiano, "until you renounce your Christ." Agatha, without losing her serenity, removed her sandals herself. Before taking the first step upon the burning coals, she raised her eyes to the sky and spoke a few words that the witnesses recorded for posterity. "Lord, who created and protected me since childhood, who has kept my body from impurity and given me the strength of love, receive now my spirit." Bichu, as Agatha walked upon the scorching coals, something extraordinary occurred, something that even her most devout supporters had not anticipated. A sudden tremor shook the amphitheater, causing part of its structure to collapse and instilling panic among the onlookers. The guards, terrified by what they interpreted as a divine sign, abandoned their posts. Amid the chaos, only Agatha remained serene, as if she were walking on a bed of flowers rather than burning coals. Quintiano, though visibly disturbed by these events, refused to acknowledge divine intervention. In his desperation to maintain control, he ordered that the saint be returned to her cell, this time with strict orders to deprive her of any medical care. Yet this new torment would only serve to set the stage for Agatha's final triumph, where her martyrdom would be completed in the most glorious manner. Chapter 8. The Final Torments. The final act of Agatha's martyrdom began in the cold pre-dawn of a February morning in the year 251. Quintiano, consumed by an obsession that bordered on madness, ordered that the saint be dragged over a bed of burning coals and shards of glass. The order specified that the torment should be carried out in the streets of Catania, transforming the entire city into a witness of his cruel vengeance. However, as the executioners prepared this terrible ordeal, an extraordinary phenomenon began to manifest. The sky, hitherto clear, darkened with threatening clouds, and Mount Etna, which loomed over the city's horizon, began to roar with an unsettling intensity. The young martyr was led along the main streets of Catania, her battered body leaving a trail of blood on the cobblestones. But instead of cries of pain, only prayers and words of forgiveness for her tormentors escaped her lips. Witnesses reported that while she was dragged over the burning coals, a supernatural light seemed to envelop her, and the air became filled with a sweet fragrance reminiscent of spring flowers. The crowd, who on other occasions had watched executions with a morbid fascination, now observed in awed silence, aware that they were witnessing something that transcended mere human cruelty. In the midst of this final torment, Agatha raised a prayer that the present Christians recorded for posterity. Lord, who created me and protected me since childhood, who kept my body from impurity and gave me the strength of love, receive now my spirit. Barely had she finished these words when a violent earthquake shook the city. The walls began to tremble, and part of the structure where Quintiano was located collapsed, though it did not reach him. Panic seized the crowd, and amid the chaos, Agatha, with a supernatural serenity, surrendered her spirit to God. It was on February 5th, a date that would forever be inscribed in the calendar of the Church. Chapter 9. The First Miracles. Exactly 1 year after Agatha's martyrdom, Mount Etna erupted in one of its most violent eruptions ever recorded. Lava flowed menacingly toward Catania, and its inhabitants, terrified, recalled the saint's words during her martyrdom. In an act of desperate faith, a group of Christians took the veil that had covered her body at burial and held it before the advancing lava. To the astonishment of the entire city, the fiery stream miraculously halted, diverting its course and sparing Catania from destruction. This first public miracle established Saint Agatha as the protector of the city against the dangers of fire and volcanic eruptions. Her tomb soon became a center of pilgrimage. Testimonies of miraculous healings multiplied, the blind regaining sight, the sick being cured instantly, and especially women finding relief from ailments related to the chest, a poignant reminder of the particular martyrdom the saint had endured. The site of her burial emanated an extraordinary perfume, described by pilgrims as a blend of roses and lilies, the same aroma that had been sensed during her martyrdom. Even pagans who approached out of curiosity were often converted to Christianity, deeply impressed by the prodigies they witnessed. News of these miracles spread quickly beyond the borders of Sicily. Sailors departing from the port of Catania carried tales of the wonders they had seen, and soon pilgrims began arriving from all corners of the Mediterranean. The Roman authorities, who had tried to silence Agatha's testimony with her martyrdom, found themselves powerless as her death unleashed a wave of faith that they could not control. Bolstered by these unmistakable signs of divine favor, Christians began to express their faith more openly, drawing inspiration from Agatha's example to face their own trials. The deepest impact of these early miracles was seen in the spiritual transformation of the city. Many of those who had witnessed her martyrdom, including some of her executioners, converted to Christianity. Aphrodisia's house, where Agatha had been imprisoned, was transformed into a place of prayer, and the women who had lived there became the first guardians of her memory. As for Quintiano himself, the chronicles report that he met a tragic end when he fell from his horse while attempting to confiscate the properties of Agatha's family, an event that Christians interpreted as a manifestation of divine justice. Prayer to Saint Agatha Glorious, Saint Agatha, Virgin and Blessed Martyr, who with your blood wrote a testimony of eternal love for Christ, you who in the bloom of your youth chose the hardest path and transformed pain into victory, hear our humble prayer today. In the trials of our daily lives, when the fire of tribulation threatens us, extend over us your protective veil, just as you have done so many times over Catania. May your example of unyielding strength inspire us to keep our faith steadfast, and your courage in the face of martyrdom teach us to defend our convictions with dignity. Intercede for us, blessed Saint, before the throne of the Most High, for the sick who suffer in their bodies, especially those afflicted with breast cancer, for the women who face violence and persecution, for those who struggle against injustice, for those seeking truth in the midst of darkness, and for all who need your maternal protection. May your compassionate gaze rest upon those who come to you in trust. As you defended your purity and faith, defend us from all harm. As you resisted the temptations of worldly power, help us remain true to our values. As you transformed suffering into glory, teach us to find meaning in our trials. And when the time comes for our own testimony, be it in life or in death, may we, like you, joyfully proclaim, Lord, who created and protected me since childhood, who kept my body from impurity and gave me the strength of love, receive my prayer for all your children who still journey through this valley of tears. Amen.